You would open your Old Testament to Ecclesiastes chapter 12. Ecclesiastes chapter 12. And as we have announced, we are going to address the topic tonight of growing old with no regrets. I have never thought of myself as being old until a few months ago. And I'm sure there's some here who say, well, you're not old. Well, compared to my mother, no, I'm not. She lived to be 97. Grandmother lived to be 100. That's old. At least it used to be. But a few months ago, I lost the best friend I ever had on the planet, a brother in the Lord, and he was 64. And all of a sudden, I realized my own mortality. See, the book says 70, 80 by reason of strength. And folks, I'm closer to going out than I am coming in. And that's just all there is to it. If I get my 70, 7 years. That's not very long at all. 80, well, I might get a little more than that then. If I'm lucky, or blessed, I should say, and got the good genes, the ones that live to be a long time, I might make it to 100 or 103 like my cousin Cecil, but I don't see myself getting much further than that. So the reality is, even at 100, I'm closer to going out than I am to coming in. If I'm going to get it done, I better get it done in a hurry. And I think that's the reality for most of us. But this is not just a lesson for old people. So you younger folks, don't turn me off, because the punchline is important. But how can we live to be old and not have any regrets? And I believe that that is exactly what the book of Ecclesiastes is all about. And I want us to begin here in chapter 12 and read the first 8 verses of that chapter, and then we're going to go back and pick a few out of chapter 11 and see what it is that Solomon is trying to teach us here. But in verse 1 he says, "Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth, while the evil days come not, nor the years draw nigh, when thou shalt say, I have no pleasure in them. While the sun, or the light, or the moon, or the stars be not darkened, nor the clouds return after the rain. In the day when the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men shall bow themselves, and the grinders cease because they are few, and those that look out of the windows be darkened, and the doors shall be shut in the streets, when the sound of the grinding is low, and he shall rise up at the voice of a bird, and all the daughters of music shall be brought low. When they shall be afraid of that which is high, and fears shall be in the way, and the almond tree shall flourish, and the grasshopper shall be a burden, and desire shall fail. Because man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets. Or ever the silver cord be loosed, or the golden bowl be broken, or the pitcher be broken at the fountain, or the wheel be broken at the cistern. Then shall the dust return to the earth as it was, and the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. Vanities of vanities, saith the preacher, all is vanity." Well, those birthdays keep adding up. The evil days draw nigh, when you shall say, I have no pleasure in them. You can't stop the process. Jack Benny tried. He wanted to be 39 for as long as possible. He probably had 39 39th birthdays. But you can't be 39, and you can't stop aging. You can't cease to grow old. And the reality is that with age, the joys of life diminish. the sun and the moon and the stars are darkened, and the clouds return after the rain. Not only do the joys of life diminish, but the hardships and the disappointments keep on coming. Maybe the sun comes out for a little while, but what happens? The rain is going to come. Into every life a little rain must fall, said the lyricist. And that's the truth, and we can't escape that. And the longer you live, the more you realize that's the case. Now, I'm not trying to be a negative Nancy, but I am trying to be realistic. And one of the reasons why people do not enjoy their old age or do not look forward to advancing in age is because they do not have a realistic perspective of what it means to get older. That's what Solomon is trying to teach us here, because notice there at verse 8 he says, vanity of vanities, saith the preacher. All is vanity. Most people don't understand the book of Ecclesiastes because they do not understand what Solomon's talking about. You go back to the beginning of the book and he makes it clear. He's talking about life under the sun. He's talking about life without God. And the man who lives life without God, his only conclusion about life from beginning to end is all is vanity, vexation, striving after wind. If you're like me, you can remember when you used to go out at night. It's about the time you go to bed at night now. You know, go to school all day, work all afternoon. On a Friday night, go to a ball game, march on the field, come off the field, go change out of your uniform. It's about 10 o'clock. Time to howl. No. Cindy and I are in bed long before 10 o'clock anymore. That's just the way it is. I got this quote from Eleanor Roosevelt. It's pretty good. She's defining middle age. She says, middle age is that time of life when the eager passions of youth are cooled and the infirmities of age not yet begun. Well, I have passed middle age because the infirmities of age have begun. It's not just the white hair. That's the least of my concerns. But these things that Solomon is describing here, in the day when the keepers of the house shall tremble, and the strong men shall bow themselves. You got back pain? I do. Ever stand up and then have to straighten up? And the grinders cease because they are few. Well, modern dentistry's helped us a little bit on that. But I remember my mother, who had some of the best dental work in the world, but like a lot of things, she managed to outlive that. You know, you lose a bridge, a couple of teeth. There for a while, she didn't even have any teeth. Let me tell you, that's a miserable situation to be in. The grinders cease because they are few, and those that look out of the windows be darkened. You know, I've been nearsighted as long as I've been around. And then I got to be about 43 or 4, and I became farsighted. And now on top of all of that, I've got cataracts coming on. You know, can't see without these. I can't see with them on half the time. And at night, I can't see hardly to drive because of the glare. You know what I'm talking about. And the doors shall be shut in the streets. That may refer to the mouth. Job talks about himself and the fact that because of his infirmity there in Job 41 verse 14, that he'd lost his teeth, and so he kept his mouth shut because his smile was not what it ought to be. or what he wanted it to be. Have you ever known anybody like that, embarrassed because their teeth were bad? So the doors shall be shut in the street when the grinding is low. It's hard to eat. And he shall rise up at the voice of the bird. And all the daughters of music shall be brought low. And so hearing fails and the voice fails. I used to could sing, but not much anymore. When they shall be afraid of that which is high. I told you, you've been watching me hold on to the corner over here when I go down at night. I was telling someone the other day, I said the reason that is because 18 inches is a lot higher than it used to be. I stepped off the back of a trailer a couple of months ago and jammed this right knee, and I got a squishy knee. I would have jumped off the back of that trailer when I was 20, 25, even 30. Wouldn't have thought anything about it. Fears shall be in the way, and the almond tree shall flourish. Well, you can get a good idea of what that is. Almond trees have white flowers. And the grasshopper shall be a burden, the slightest weight. I remember when I was a kid, we went out to Cheyenne, Oklahoma to see the memorial out there for the Ouachita massacre where Custer and the Cheyenne fought their battle there in Sand Creek, and got out of the car, and it was a dry year, and so the grasshoppers just got up all over the place. They just covered you up nearly, some of them, when they'd light on you. Just one of those, a burden. Think about that. And desires shall fail. You just don't care anymore. You don't want to do it. One of my favorite little memes to send around to my friends on their birthday is the older you get, the less you care. It's got a big chicken and a pair of overalls. You just don't care. Wearing sunglasses and a bow tie, I think. But you just don't care. There's some things that don't matter anymore. Because man goeth to his long home, and the mourners go about the streets. We're all headed to the cemetery. We're all going to meet the Lord. And then verses 6 and 7 are some of the most beautiful words that have ever been uttered to describe death. Or ever the silver cord be loosed, or the silver band be loosed. Life is described as something that's bound up by a precious band. And it's loosed. It's gone. Or the golden bowl be broken. That precious bowl that contains life is broken. When the bowl is broken, when the band is loose, life is gone. Or the pitcher be broken at the fountain. Go to the well, you have your pitcher. Remember when Jesus was sitting at the well there in John 4 with the woman? He had nothing with which to draw. When the pitcher is broken, you can't hold water. Or the wheel is broken at the cistern. You can't let the bucket down without the wheel. And so these are all images of describing how it is impossible to retain life when it is time to go. That precious thing that we call life is lost. And so the dust, that's our bodies, return to the earth as it was. For out of the dust thou wast made, and unto the dust thou shalt return, is what God told Adam. And the spirit shall return unto God who gave it. That's the reality, and we need to understand that that's the reality. That's not something to fear. That's not something to be afraid of. That's not something to be worried about. But it is something to prepare for. And it is something that ought to give what life we have some perspective and drive us in the right direction with regard to our proper use. So what is it that you and I can do to be able to live life to the fullest without having any regrets? Now, when I say that, I'm not talking about never having made a mistake, because that's just off the page. That's not how the Bible begins. We're all going to make mistakes, regardless of what age we are or how long we live. We're going to make mistakes. But does our life have to be a waste? Does it have to be, as is described there in verse 8, vanity of vanities? Does it have to be that vexation of spirit, a chasing after the wind, as the World English Bible translates that phrase? And so, in order for us to have that life that we ought to have, and to attain that old age that we're seeking, whatever it might be, and not have any regrets, we've got to do several things. And I believe that's what Solomon is hinting at in these chapters here, these last two chapters. And the first thing on the list I would suggest to you is that Solomon tells us, in order to achieve, because chapter 11 is immediately before verse 12, or chapter 12, and verse 1 says, "Remember now thy Creator in the days of thy youth." He goes back, he's talking to the young people. There's my punchline right there. He's talking to young people. He's not talking to old people. He's talking to young people. He says, if you want to be able to meet this reality, these evil days, wherein you're not going to have any pleasure, you don't want your life to be a waste, then here's what you need to do. And chapter 11 there, look at verses 9 and 10, which is the lead into chapter 12. "Rejoice, O young man, in thy youth, and let thy heart cheer thee in the days of thy youth, and walk in the ways of thine heart, and in the sight of thine eyes. But know thou that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment. Therefore remove sorrow from thy heart, and put away evil from thy flesh, for childhood and youth are vanity." Childhood and youth are vanity under the sun without God. But there's something you need to do, and so that's where chapter 12 begins. Remember now in your youth thy Creator. This whole book is intended to drive us to the conclusion that we've got to focus on God. And so the first thing is that we have to acquire a correct worldview. Solomon states 4 foundation principles with regard to worldview in the 11th chapter. The first one is expressed in verse 5. He said, "As thou knowest not what is the way of the Spirit, nor how the bones do grow in the womb of her that is with child, even so thou knowest not the works of God who maketh all." You've got to understand that God is in control. This is difficult for most people. We want to control life. We want to manage our life. We want to determine things. One of the saddest things I've ever seen is some young person who's full of vim and vigor and looking at the future, and then tragedy strikes their life. And they have not yet formulated a realization that God is in control, and then at that point they want to blame God. Now, God's not micromanaging our lives. God's not doing that. Some people have the idea that whatever happens is God's will. I don't believe that. I believe most of what happens in the world is not God's will. It's not God's will that people be killed, murdered, raped, maimed. It's not God's will that there should be war. None of that is God's will. That's men who are without God that are causing all those problems. And the reality is oftentimes those who have absolutely through no fault of their own are affected by that. And so sometimes good people suffer because wicked people are in control. And what we have to realize is that God is in control, and what I mean by that is you've got to trust God. I remember when Job was suffering, And there in the concluding chapters of the book of Job, when God finally speaks to Job by the whirlwind, he says to him, where were you when I formed or laid the foundations of the earth? I'd ask you that question. Where were you? Well, I didn't even exist. That's my point. What do you know about it? What do you know about the formation of the foundations of the earth? What do you know about the universe? I get really upset when people, why did God do this? Or why did God do that? Or why did God allow that to happen? I don't know why things happen necessarily. But the reality is that I don't know what today holds, let alone what tomorrow holds, but I know who holds tomorrow. And that's the God of heaven. In James, the 4th chapter, verses 13 through 17, James chapter 4, verses 13 through 17. Go now, ye that say, today or tomorrow we will go into such a city and continue there a year and buy and sell and get gain, whereas you know not what shall be on the morrow. For what is your life? It is even a vapor that appeareth for a little time and then vanisheth away. For what you ought to say, if the Lord will, we shall live and do this or that. But now you rejoice in your boastings. All such rejoicing is evil. Therefore to him that knoweth to do good and doeth it not, to him it is sin. And that passage gets abused. I hear people say, well, that's the sins of omission. That's not what that's talking about necessarily, what some people want to call the sins of omission. What that passage is talking about is the man who knows what he ought to be doing and he doesn't do it. And that would apply to the believer who ought to know that the thing to do, what's the most important thing today? You know, we get up in the morning, we start writing on our calendar, well, I got to go to the dentist, I got to go to the dry cleaners, I got to go pick up the kids after school, I got to do this, I got to do that, and then we're on the next day, yada, 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 and I got to, and what's the most important thing that you do today? See, one of these days, all that's not going to matter, and it's going to be Judgment Day. Or it's going to be the day that we meet the Lord because we die. And then what's important? The only thing that's important is whether or not I'm right with God. And that's what this whole passage is about. This passage is not talking about some kind of special providence or something like that. This passage is saying you need to be realistic in your understanding of how the world works, and you don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. That's what Jesus was teaching in Matthew chapter 6. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Don't worry about tomorrow. Sufficient today is the evil thereof. You do what's right today. You be right today. You've got to have the correct worldview, and the correct worldview is that we have to commit our souls under the keeping of a faithful Creator. 1 Peter 4, verse 19. So we wake up every day trusting God, and the only way we can trust God is that we're walking in the light as He is in the light. The second thing that Solomon points out to us here in chapter 11 is that we recognize that God will judge. We read that a moment ago, and I've partly already implied that, but notice in verse 9 again, know thou that for all these things God will bring thee into judgment. One of the things that I have come to realize is that from the very beginning of the Bible all the way to the end of the Bible, there is a clear message that God is going to judge. I used to think, well, judgment or final judgment was a New Testament teaching. Well, that's just not true. I know that Enoch was prophesying about the final judgment because Jude says so in verse 7. It says that the seventh from Adam, Enoch, prophesied that he would come with 10,000 of his saints. Now, that's not recorded in the book of Genesis, but inspiration says that's what he preached. And here in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verse 14, for God shall bring every work into judgment. That's not just talking about temporal judgment. I know that's not the case because there are a lot of wicked people that get away with it. But I do know this, there aren't any wicked people that are going to escape the judgment of God in eternity. That's what I need to be concerned with today. Am I able and ready to face God in the judgment right now? I need to trust God, and I need to fear God. And that's why Solomon says, remember now thy Creator. We serve a living God. We do not serve an absentee deity. Hebrews 10:31, it is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Then the third thing I need to realize in order to frame a proper worldview, this as opposed to just living life without God, I need to understand that God will provide. There in verse 1, cast thy bread upon the waters, for thou shalt find it after many days. That's one of the most difficult sayings in the Old Testament. I think I understand it. I'm not sure. I didn't quite get a handle on it until I lived down at Humphrey when I first started preaching. Bread is by metonymy used for seed. Bread is the result of seed sown. And to cast your bread upon the water, that's what we'd do down there at Humphrey. We'd cast our rice and let it sprout. And that was a method that was used in Egypt along the Nile River, that they would sow the seed, and then the rains and the flooding would come, and those seeds would sprout. And that's one explanation, and I think that's the correct explanation. I can't see myself going out and throwing slices of light bread on the lake, you know. But it's even though that may be the figure, the whole idea is why do I do that? Because I'm trusting God to give the increase. You never met a farmer who was an atheist. At least I haven't. They can't explain why life is in the seed, but they know that it's there. They put their trust in God, and they depend on Him to provide. And so then verse 6, look at that. In the morning sow thy seed, in the evening withhold not thine hand, for thou knowest not whether shall prosper either this or that, or whether they both shall be alike good. I think what he's talking about is being a generous person, being an open-handed person. And when you look at Jesus in Matthew 6, when he talks about anxiety and worry and laying up treasure in heaven, and the parallels in Luke 6, where he says, lend and ask nothing in return. This seems to be the idea that we trust God. We do the right thing, and we live life in such a way as that we're not worried about it. People who worry about the future are generally not open-handed. They're not liberal. What are they doing with their money? What are they doing with their resources? They're hoarding them to themselves. They're laying them up where moth and rust will corrupt. The open-handed person, he's being liberal, he's being generous, he's taking care of his family, his friends, his neighbors, and he's trusting God to give the increase. Notice there in Philippians chapter 4 and verse 6 that Paul tells us to be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known unto God. We pray, give us this day our daily bread, and we get up and go to work. We trust God to take care of His people. And we trust God's people to help His people. And that's how we've got to live. And we're never going to be the kind of person that we need to be if we're not doing that. And then the fourth criteria, there in verse 13 of chapter 12, Solomon says, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep His commandments, for this is the whole, and duty is in italics in the King James, for this is the whole of man. We've got to realize that God alone satisfies. We've got to learn to be content with what God provides. That same Philippians chapter 4, just a few verses south there in that chapter, beginning at verse 11. Paul says, "Not that I speak in respect of want, for I've learned in whatever state I am therewith to be content. I know both how to be abased, and I know how to abound. Everywhere and in all things I am instructed both to be full and to be hungry, both to abound and to suffer need. I can do all things through Christ, which strengtheneth me." Now that doesn't mean you can leap over tall buildings in a single bound. But it means whatever adversity, whatever difficulty in life, you are capable of meeting and overcoming with the strength which the faith of Christ provides. Now, this is a realistic worldview. It's not always going to be easy. And let me tell you something. If we get out of our little glass bubble and see how our brethren have to live in other parts of the world, we might realize just how hard it is to be a Christian sometimes. People living in grass huts, having murdering thugs break in on them and kill them in their meeting houses, and living in abject poverty, and yet they keep the faith and they're there assembling with the saints, and they love one another and they take care of one another. They have all the same kinds of problems everybody else does on top of that. And so we've got to have this worldview, and once we have acquired this correct worldview where we trust God, fear God, are grateful to God, and content with God, then we can become, and this is the second thing, a resilient believer. There in verse 8 of chapter 11, Solomon says, "Remember the days of darkness, for they shall be many." Or in Ecclesiastes chapter 9 and verse 11, "The race is not to the swift. Time and chance happeneth to them all." You know, that's the hardest lesson in life to learn. That sometimes through absolutely no fault of your own, you dotted all the I's, you crossed all the T's, you obeyed all the rules, you did everything you were supposed to do, and you still didn't get the prize. You didn't get the promotion, you didn't get the girl, you didn't get the car, you didn't get the job, whatever it is, and something comes along and disappoints you, you miss out. Maybe you just happened to have gotten really sick one day and didn't get to show up to take the test. Things happen. And rather than be bitter, driven to unbelief and despair, we need to be the kind of person who can overcome and put things in the right perspective. And that's why this worldview is the place to start. I'm turning to Psalm 37. There's two Psalms I want you to remember. They're twins. I said 37. That's the one I want you to remember. I'm going to read from 73. Psalm 37 and Psalm 73. Those two go together. I'm going to read from Psalm 73 about verse, I'm going to read in verse 2. Because this describes the fellow. This is David. He says, "But as for me, my feet were almost gone. My steps had well nigh slipped." He's downcast. He's about ready to give up. He's ready to quit. He's not talking about just quit trying. He's talking about giving up his faith. "For I was envious at the foolish when I saw the prosperity of the wicked." Then drop down there to verse 13. He describes himself, "Verily, I have cleansed my heart in vain." What good did it do me to be a good person? What good did it do me to go to church? What good did it do me to read my Bible, to pray, and to give? What good did that do? It's all in vain, and I washed my hands in innocency. For all the day long have I been plagued and chastened every morning. If I say I will speak thus, behold, I should offend against the generation of my children. He says, I know I shouldn't be saying things like this, but this is the way I feel. And that's how you need to read the Psalms. The Psalms are telling The Psalms are about real life, folks. And you don't have to tell me, but you know that people feel this way. They get discouraged. They get despondent. They despair. Maybe you have. And you're just ready to quit. Nothing is working for me. And I don't understand why. I'm a good person. And I was envious of the wicked because they prospered. Just think about old Jeremiah there in, chapter 12 and verse 1. He was dealing with the same thing. They threw him down in the dungeon full of mud. That song we sing, I was sinking deep in sin, deep in the miry clay. That's where that comes from. That's based upon the language that was describing Jeremiah sunk down in that pit. Drop on down to verse 20. As a dream when one awakeneth, so, O Lord, when thou awakest, thou shalt despise their image. Now, why does he say that? Because he has a change of perspective. He gets his worldview straight. So in verse 16 he says, when I thought to know this, it was too painful for me until I went into the sanctuary of God, then understood I their end. Surely thou didst set them in slippery places, thou castest them down to destruction. How are they brought unto desolation? As in a moment, utterly they are consumed with terrors. They're going to be judged. God is going to avenge his people. As a New Testament example of that, turn back to 2 Thessalonians chapter 1. Notice verse 6, seeing it is a righteous thing with God to recompense tribulation to them that trouble you, and to you who are troubled, rest with us when the Lord Jesus shall be revealed from heaven with his mighty angels in flaming fire, taking vengeance on them that know not God and obey not the gospel of our Lord Jesus Christ, who shall be punished with everlasting destruction from the presence of the Lord and from the glory of his power. Seeing that it is a righteous thing with God to recompense tribulation to them that troubled you. Now someone says, well, that's not doing me any good right now. Why isn't it doing you some good right now? You know, part of our problem in this country in particular is that we see absolutely no merit, no good, no benefit in suffering. So as parents, we want to make it easier on our kids than it was for us. And there's some noble ambition in that. But do you want to remove all adversity for your children? Because the day is going to come when you're not going to be there to do that. They're going to have to deal with some problems eventually. Life just doesn't work that way. But everybody wants you to think it is. There shouldn't be any struggle. And this is why the advocates of euthanasia, just as that's what's that got to do with this? Well, just think about it in a minute. So here's a person who's sick. They're suffering. I've known some wonderful people who faced their illnesses to the very end because they found the value in suffering. Suffering with dignity. Well, I want to die with my dignity. No, you want to die with no suffering. You don't want to test your faith. You don't want to rely on God. You don't want to endure. And someone said, that just sounds cruel. No, because that shows the value of human life. That shows the value of the relationship of man to his God. There's not anything more selfish than killing babies because I don't want to be bothered. That's the argument. Let's just remove the inconvenience. This is where we are in a world. If we can, it doesn't matter if it inconveniences me. Let's get rid of it. So we can lie, we can steal, we can kill. But that's not how Christians live. And they meet their problems and they deal with the consequences of their sins, and they deal with them in faith and trust. And we become resilient believers. But I was reading there in Psalm 73, and I've got to get back over there now because I was at verse 20. So as a dream, when one awakeneth, so, O Lord, when thou awakest, thou shalt despise their image. Thus my heart was grieved, and I was pricked in my reins. So foolish was I and ignorant. I was as a beast before thee. Nevertheless, I am continually with thee. Thou hast holden me by thy right hand. Thou shalt guide me with thy counsel, and afterward receive me to glory. He doesn't say you're going to take my problem away, does he? No, you've guided me with your counsel. Whom have I in heaven but thee? And there is none upon the earth that I desire beside thee. My flesh and my heart faileth, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. For lo, they are far from thee. They that are far from thee shall perish. Thou hast destroyed all them that go a-whoring from thee. But it is good for me to draw near to God. I have put my trust in the Lord, that I may declare all thy works. So with this worldview, we become resilient believers. And then we spend our life working to put away sin. There in verse 10, therefore remove sorrow from thy heart and put away evil from thy flesh. That's the third thing that we must do in order to live to an old age without any regrets. You know, longevity is conducive to holiness, but it is not a guarantee. Notice there in Proverbs chapter 16 and verse 31, Proverbs 16, verse 31, the hoary head is a crown of glory if it be found in the way of righteousness. There's not anything more disgusting than a dirty old man. Nothing more pitiful to look upon than an old man who gets to advanced age and he has absolutely no righteousness within him. What we need to understand, though, and that's not to say that even that one cannot be saved, because that's not the case. And I'm not saying that the wicked old person can't be saved, or the person who's come to age and in late in life learned the gospel can't be saved. What I'm saying is that we ought to account that the long suffering of our Lord is salvation. 2 Peter 3 verse 15. You know, my grandmother Asher, she obeyed the gospel in about 1974, I think. She was in her 70s. I've mentioned already how we were Methodist, and she was reared Methodist and reared my daddy in the Methodist faith. But when she came to live with us, she started going with us on a regular basis to Bible study. She'd always come down about once a month, maybe twice a month, bring a Kohler coffee cake or something like that from Little Rock and spend the weekend. And we'd get up on Sunday morning. She said, y'all go to Bible class, and I'm going to make the beds and put the dishes away, and then I'm going to come to church. And so that's what she did those times. And then when she moved to live with us, she started going every time we went. And it wasn't very long after Daddy would have Bible studies with her that she obeyed the gospel. I think that's the one thing that was the proudest moment of my dad's life, that he converted his mother. He was happy about that. But she was 70-something years old. All of my dad's kids were grown. But he was glad, and she even outlived him. That's the thing about it. She outlived him and was a faithful Christian till the day that she died. The long suffering of God is a blessing. It is an opportunity for us to be saved, so that familiarity with Christ produces holiness. I want you to look over there at Romans 5, 1 through 5 on this point about familiarity with God or familiarity with Christ. Therefore, being justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ. That's when we've been raised to walk in newness of life. by whom also we have access by faith into this grace, wherein we stand and rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. We're in a saved relationship, a relationship characterized by grace. And not only so, but we glory, we boast, we rejoice in tribulations. And that the world that doesn't make any sense to the world. But the believer rejoices in tribulations. Also knowing, why? Also knowing that tribulation worketh patience or endurance. That's why I was saying earlier about suffering. Suffering, enduring trial is a good thing. Why? Because it produces endurance within us. If you don't ever have anything, here's a perfect example. If I were going to therapy for this knee, and I may go yet, but anyway, if I were going to therapy for this knee, what would that therapist be making me do? It'd be making me work that knee and push against the pressure. I've seen my mother do that with her knee surgery. They put her on that machine and they were moving that knee. She had to push against that. You have resistance. That's what gets you stronger. And so tribulation worketh endurance, or patience, and patience, experience, or wisdom. See, that's the value of having to go through things in life, and this is why I say it's not hard or it's not wrong to try and shield your children from some things, because some things in life are more than they can handle at their age. I understand that. But they have to deal with the problems eventually. They have to learn how to deal with problems. And then through life, as they deal with problems, what do they gain? They gain experience. They gain wisdom. And if they're Christians and they're studying their Bible and they're trusting in God, they've got the right worldview, then they are developing a Christian character that's going to be able to sustain them into old age. And then experience works hope. Confident expectation. The person who has been successfully overcoming the trials of life because they've been trusting in the Lord Jesus Christ and His gospel and His word, that person has hope. But the person who faces a trial or is unprepared to face a trial and then becomes despondent and despairs and they lose their faith, they're not going to make it. And so we're trying to overcome sin. We're trying to get rid of sin. And we're learning how to deal with it. And so we ought to be thankful for the grace of God, because we stand in that relationship where we have a high priest in Jesus Christ, and we can go to Him and ask Him for the forgiveness of our sins in our times of need. And we read that the other day in Hebrews chapter 4. And then finally, turn over there to Psalm 92, 12 through 14. There in verses 9 and 10 of chapter 12, Solomon says of the preacher, and I think it is Solomon, I think he's talking about himself, but we could debate that another time if you disagree with that. But he says of the preacher, he says that he was wise and he still taught the people knowledge. Yeah, he gave good heed and sought out and set in order many proverbs. He became an example. He became a teacher. In Psalm 92, verse 12, sometimes older saints, or maybe younger saints talking about older saints, think of them as being worn out, not much use to the church. Well, I sometimes send my friends a birthday greeting, and I send them a picture of an old rusty truck, sometimes with a big tree growing up through the middle of it. And then I have this caption, better that you wear out than rust out. I don't want to be parked off over here somewhere in the woods with a big tree growing up through the middle of me. I hadn't moved in 50 years. I want to wear myself out in the service of the Lord. And so the psalmist says there in Psalm 92, verse 12, the righteous shall flourish like the palm tree. He shall grow like a cedar in Lebanon. Those that be planted in the house of the Lord shall flourish in the courts of our God. They shall bring forth fruit in old age. They shall be fat and flourishing. They shall bring forth fruit in old age. In Isaiah 46 and verse 4, Isaiah is speaking to the nation, but he's speaking to them distributively of their individual relationship to God, but because they are his covenant people, his chosen nation. He says in verse 3, "Hearken to me, O house of Jacob, and all the remnant of the house of Israel, which are born by me from the belly, which are carried from the womb. And even to your old age I am he, and even to hoar hairs will I carry you. I have made, and I will bear, even I will carry, and will deliver you." God is with you from the womb to the tomb. And we need to realize that. And we need to rely upon that. And we're seeking to be examples. That's what we're talking about. Being teachers, we want to be examples. Well, how are we going to be an example? Well, I'm going to be that old saint who comes in here on the walker, who can't hear, who can't sing, who barely has enough eyesight to read, and sits down on the front and makes a bunch of clattering noise while getting in and getting out. But I'm going to be there. Nelwyn can speak to this. We grew up at 6th Street Church there in the old meeting house, and 3 areas of seats like this. It was a big building. And most of my youth, it was full. And my mom and dad, they always had us down front. And we were about 3rd or 4th row back on the far side. That'd be the east side of the building. And on the 2nd row from the front, in front of us, was Sister Calhoun, Sister Roberts, and Sister Bradley. And they were there every Sunday that I can remember. And Sister Calhoun was old when I was a kid. And I always thought Sister Roberts was old, but I think she just looked older than she was, but she was still much older than we were. And then Sister Bradley, and she was the last one. Sister Calhoun was the first to pass. I used to just get so tickled at her because she knew where the preacher was going in his sermon before he could get there. And she'd be turning the Bible, and she had that old hearing aid, and she couldn't hear it thunder. And she'd be talking to Sister Roberts, and she'd be telling her the scripture, and we could all hear it, you know. And then it was Sister Roberts. She fell and broke her hip. She couldn't get out anymore, and then she died at home. And so Sister Bradley sat there for the longest time by herself. And then finally she was gone. But I remember those 3 saints, and I don't think I'll ever forget them. When I first started preaching, had 2 sections in the building, and over here on the right, on the 2nd row, were my old men. Brother Dabbs on the end, Brother Winfred Yarber to him, next to him, then Brother Harold Langford next to him. And then when he came down from Dice, or after he moved up to Russellville, Brother Linder Brantley. And they sat there every Sunday, usually, those three of the 4 at least. And then when Brother Brantley came, they all 4 sat there. They'd been sitting there together for years and years and years and years. And that's where they were sitting when I got there, and that's where they were sitting when I left, and that's where they were sitting when they died. I can think of one more. Brother Willis died. We were in the meeting house there at 6th Street one night. I was a teenager, and he and Sister Opal were sitting up in front of us about 3 rows, and we stood up to sing, and he didn't stand up. Because we always stood up, you know, before the preacher got up. That song before he got up, and he didn't stand up, and Sister Opal was kind of nudging him, and he just slumped over in the seat, dead. Where do you want to be? That's where I want to be. I want to be in the house of God. I want to be with the people of God. I want to be ready to go meet the Lord. And you're never too old to bear that kind of influence. And you need to be teaching your children that. And so, that's the end of my lesson. Except this. To really succeed at this, Solomon says in verse 1, remember thy Creator in the days of thy youth. Don't wait till you're old and worn out. I've had people say, well, after I get through living life, young people, after I get through having all my fun, then I'll be a Christian. You are wasting your strength. You're wasting your mind. I started preaching when I was 17 years old. They stuck me in a trailer down by the meeting house there in Umphrey, down on the bayou, and I spent every day studying, just me. Did that for 3 years. Wouldn't trade for it for nothing. I can't do it anymore. Too many gray cells are gone. Too many aches and pains. Too many vertebrae that are rubbing together. It's a lot harder to study. Get it while you're young. So when the evil days come, you won't look back on your youth as something that you wasted. Something that the Lord gave you, your strength, your mind, your zeal, your enthusiasm, all of those wonderful things that characterize youth that ought to be given to God. See? If you're not a Christian, tonight is the night. This is the favorite time and this is the favorite place right now while we stand and while we sing.